Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Tim Kulig Free Music Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Kulig, and today I have Diane from History Goes Bump. Welcome to the show.
I am so happy to be with you, Tim, and get to, as we were saying earlier, meet each other.
That's right. And I have a very important thing to acknowledge. Diane was my first Patreon, and I am very excited to have you on the show because it was very gracious of you. Sight unseen, never knew me personally, and joined my Patreon. Oftentimes with Patreons, right, it's a half a dozen to a dozen people that you know, and you build that following that way. But I had literally never spoken to you. You would grab some of my, I'll ask you in a second, but I imagine you grabbed some of my music online, decided that I had some value to add to your podcast, and all of a sudden I was like, hey, I've got myself a page. This is great. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. I very much am very gracious for your contribution.
Well, I'm happy that I got to pop that cherry for you, because I remember when I got my first patron over at Patreon, and I was like, wow, somebody will actually give me money for what I'm doing. Right. This can actually work. It's very cool.
Yeah, it was very awesome. And then I started checking out the podcast and the stories. I mean, one of the first things I have to acknowledge here is longevity. Okay. And I have some big questions about that because, as you can imagine, any creator is concerned about staying the course and continuing on year after year. And I looked at your blog today and noticed massive consistency from 2014, if I'm remembering correctly. Okay, from 2014 on, it looks like 2015, you guys went nuts. There was at least 100 plus blog posts. So it sounds like you guys had a lot of shows to put in there. You guys were really excited in the beginning there. But then year over year, it's in like the 50 range. So I'm assuming every blog post is a new show. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Okay. So how do you do it? How do you do it? How do you stay so consistent? Tell my audience how you stay consistent.
Well, one of the things is I'm a type A personality, so that really helps, especially if you're an independent creator, because you're your boss. So you're not going to get the stuff done unless you push yourself to do it. One of the things I always tell people when they're thinking about starting something, in particular a podcast, since that's my specialty, I always say the number one thing to consider when you're going to start a podcast is, what is your topic going to be? And is it something that you absolutely love, that even if nobody's listening, or maybe your mom and dad and a few friends are listening, you would still be doing it? Because then that's going to help you go. If you're doing something that you're like, well, I don't really care for true crime necessarily, but that's like the hot ticket and everybody wants to listen to true crime, so I guess I better do that, you're just not going to stick with it. You're going to get bored. And
well, that inauthenticity is going to come through in the podcast too, right?
I agree. Yeah, it totally is.
Yeah, anything that's a grind and a bummer, that just, there's no hiding that, right? I mean, if somebody asked me to do a musical style that I don't like, which honestly, there's not a lot that I won't try.
I was going to say, I think you've done everything. So.
I haven't done country. So okay. I haven't done country yet. I'm not opposed to it, but I haven't touched country. The next album, which is the first album of the year that's coming out, is actually going to be spaghetti Western. So
nice.
Yeah, and I'm actually doing some things currently for Kelly, the gentleman I was talking about before we started recording, for his podcast and his campaign. It's literally like a spaghetti Western meets a little sci-fi thing going on. So it's definitely a flex, because it's like, okay, I can do sci-fi horror stuff, but I haven't really played around with spaghetti. I'm like, I'll give it a shot. And then I started playing different patches and making different songs with it. And I'm like, ooh, this is fun. And so I'm very excited to get that one finished. And that's going to be the catalyst for the rest of the year. Literally, it's a floodgate. Once I release that one, it's just gonna be a boom, 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 boom. Because I'm going to try and get to 1,000 this year. I may not make it, but I think I'll make it into the 900 somewhere if I don't make it to 1,000. So I know it's insane. That's like 200
you
and
are
something
insane.
songs. Look, before the AI takes over, I want to make sure I got a nice catalog out there.
Well, and that's a key thing, because AI is starting to get into everything, whether it's artwork or music. And I mean, I'm sure there's going to be AI doing podcasts eventually. There probably is AI doing podcasts.
There is. You can actually, I forget which one it was called. It was Notebook LM, I think it's called. And it's a Microsoft product. You can feed it an entire script, and these two people play off each other and talk about the whole thing. It sounds very canned after you do 2 or 3 of them, though. There's not a lot of variation. But there's a coldness to it. There's a coldness to Suno. There's a coldness to a lot of stuff out there that's AI generated, you know? Because in essence, it's going into these language models and it's pulling things at random to answer a question that you're asking. And some of the imagery is good. I mean, I have to confess, I do use the imagery for my album art, but outside of that, like none of my music has it in it. So I don't do that at all. My catalog is and will continue to be pure. I'll probably play around with that stuff for the simple benefit of ideation, you know, like maybe melody ideation and stuff like that. But to do a full song, there's people out there publishing a whole song with DistroKid to, you know, to Spotify and stuff. And I'm like, how are you proud of that? You did a prompt.
You didn't do it.
You know, you didn't wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and like, oh, that's the bridge. That's how I finished that song. Great. I got to sit down and do that, you know?
Yeah.
So it's just,
you know, the other thing that helps with longevity is fans. So whether it's, you know, fans of your music or fans of a podcast, we've built an amazing community around us that's become like a family. And so it helps to have something like that, because not only does it keep you motivated, but then it keeps you kind of on task. You know, it's like they're counting on me. When we first started producing the podcast, we were putting it up like, oh gosh, I think it was like almost every 4 or 5 days. And then finally I got into a routine where it was like every week on Thursdays. I dropped the main episode. We've started incorporating other ones on Tuesdays, but Thursdays like the top, that's the key show. That's our anchor. That's everything.
Now, did you find that particular day you got more engagement, or was it just how your schedule worked out?
Nope, that's exactly why I picked Thursdays. It seemed like Thursdays, when you start asking a lot of people when it comes to podcasts, like, when do you think's the best day to drop a podcast? And it seemed like Thursdays was the top one, because Mondays, people aren't maybe quite into getting into a podcast yet. They've got a lot of stuff at work they're trying to catch up on or whatever.
Right.
Weekends, a lot of the time people aren't listening to podcasts unless they're out in the yard doing something and they put a podcast on. So it just seems like Thursdays is a good day. They're over the hump. They're looking to the weekend. They're ready to just kind of tune out of maybe something at work and, you know, put us on in the background and act like you're doing something at work. Right?
Can't tell you how many times I listened to podcasts when I was doing accounting, finance work full time. It just throwing on a pair of headphones and everything. And then somebody says your name 3 times. You're like, oh, wait, what? You know, I am working. I am doing stuff, but it's, you know, drowning out the, you know, zoning out and drowning out the rest of the world. It's great.
Well, you probably have a brain like mine then, that you can multitask. There's some people who they're like, I have to just be focused on one thing. So if I'm listening to the podcast, I'm not getting anything done. But I usually have to have some kind of noise in the background anyway. Yeah. So it works for me.
Yeah. The only time that doesn't work is if I'm composing. So when I'm doing that, I have to be laser focused on nuance and transitions and everything else. But outside of that, if I'm doing some administrative work or just stuff around the house or whatever, to me, my senses, I like to get my senses bombarded with things, you know?
Very cool.
So what sparked the podcast in the first place? What about ghost stories and haunted locations really drove you?
For me, I'd always wanted to be on the radio ever since I was a kid. And back in 2009, Blog Talk Radio was getting started, and you could do a live show with them. And it was so old. It was very glitchy and clunky, and you called in with your actual physical phone at the house. Oh, wow. And hosted over the phone. So I would have like headphones that I plugged into my phone to host the show. And it was a political show, and I did that for like 3 years, and I got kind of tired of it because, you know, politics is so divisive. And since it was live, I would do it on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. So 3 days a week at the set time, I always had to be there. It was kind of like putting on a real radio show. And so I was like, I don't want to do that anymore. So I stopped for a while. And then in 2014, I still had that bug. And I'm like, I still want to do that. But maybe I should do something rather than a live internet radio show, do something that is a podcast, because the show that was live, it would go up later as a podcast.
Right.
But I was like, I want to do something where I can just record it when I want to, put it up when I want to. It's in my own time. And so then I was like, well, what would I want to do it about? And I'm like, well, I really love history and I really love ghost stories and stuff. And anytime I would go to a city, I always wanted to take tours, and I specifically would search out the ghost tours because to me, they're the best to take, because not only do you get the history about the city, but then you get the good seedy stuff. So they'll take you over and say, this used to be the red light district. And then over here we had a murder, and then a guy got hanged over here. And so you'd get the ghost stories with it. So I loved it. And in 2014, not only was it hard to get people to understand what a podcast was still then, because podcasting had been around for almost 10 years at that point, but most people still weren't listening, and they'd be like, well, what's a podcast? So I tell them, well, it's kind of like a radio show you can listen to when you want to. So I was searching, and I'm like, there's a lot of paranormal shows out there that are talking about weird stuff and unexplained things, but there wasn't anything that was like, here's this location, here's the history, and here's the ghost stories that go with it. So I was like, why don't I do a ghost tour that's like on a radio? And I know that you and I are of an older generation. Mm-hmm. And so
fellow Gen Xer too,
So the tagline that I came up with, ghost tours for the theater of the mind, because radio used to be the only thing that people had, not when we were kids. We at least had TV when we were kids, but they used to call it the theater of the mind because, you'd be listening to the Lone Ranger or Suspense.
Right.
And you'd have to make up the pictures in your own head. So they would call it the theater of the mind. So I was like, well, this is kind of like a ghost tour, and it's in your brain because you're listening to it for the theater of the mind. And so I just went with it. And now, a decade later, I like to say, we're still going.
That. I love that catchphrase. Every time I look at it, I chuckle and I smirk. That's fantastic. So you go on location at sometimes, right? Like you actually visit these locations. And I don't know if I dug in deep enough to know the answer to this question, so I'll just ask it. Do you actually podcast at those locations when you go on location to visit? Or is that part of your research and you come back and do the podcasts like after the fact?
Usually we go there and do the research, or we actually do our own investigating too, occasionally. And then we'll do the podcast later. We've even done it where we're road tripping. And so we're recording in the car and I'm editing at the same time.
Oh, that's awesome.
So yeah, so we've done it kind of like that as well. So I guess we kind of sometimes do it from an actual location, but generally it's like a research trip and see if we get anything, because, the stuff you see on TV or on YouTube, it's dime a dozen, and people are running around and all this crazy stuff's going on. And you're like, is that really going on? So we want to find out for ourselves and see what we get.
I often think or feel and think that some of those shows like Ghost Hunters and everything, that there's an underlying thing that they're going to visit, but I understand reality TV. There's massive embellishment, right? And they do that for ratings, they do that for viewership, but you're not really getting the full story. It's kind of masked with this Hollywood film that takes away from the lore. And it seems to me like you guys want to be as authentic to the story as possible. Is that true?
That's absolutely true. If we say something happened to us, I think our listeners totally believe we're not going to make it up, that something really did happen. Because frankly, what I found through years of doing this, having something that would transfer onto TV really well really doesn't happen. A lot of those shows are there for like a week, and we're basically doing an overnight maybe, or 3 or 4 hours. A lot of the time it's boring, not a lot's going on. And the most profound experiences we have are personal. I can't show you on TV when something touches me. I could tell you something's touching me, but you'll just have to believe me.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, is that, TV, it's always edited down so that, pacing is there. And my God, I think back to the 80s when you could watch an hour-long show and the show itself was 52 minutes and there was 7 to 8 minutes of commercials. Now you're lucky to get 40 on regular network TV. Not that I watch cable ever. If I watch a show, it's usually on YouTube or it's on, one of the major streaming networks like Netflix or Amazon. And for the most part, those avoid commercials. But even Amazon is like, well, you need to go up to this higher tier if you don't want to see commercials. At least they usually tack them on the front, But it's just, it's just full of garbage. I don't like to bombard myself with, I don't know, Cialis ads and stuff. Like, I don't want to, I just want to watch the show,
Yeah, because you're like, am I watching ads or am I watching a show? I can't figure it out.
And it pulls you out of the big thing for me is it pulls you out of that place, right? So the idea of a show, even if it's longer, it's a longer podcast with like peaks and valleys of excitement, and you're ramping up part of the story and it's getting exciting, but then there's just the lore. You got to fill in the blanks and you got to fill in the whole thing. Like I like stuff that takes a while to get into,
Yeah.
That to me, it gives me the full picture, the full story, and it's far more enjoyable. It's like reading a book, right? Except somebody's dictating it to you and they're also sharing some of their experience with you as well.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I don't know if you find this, I don't know if it transfers as much with music and stuff, but a lot of the time people are like, you feel like you're my friend.
Yeah.
Like you're talking just to me. And it is very intimate, and music can be very intimate as well because you're in somebody's ears.
Right.
And that's, a pretty intimate place to be.
Yeah, and truly, if somebody gives you the time and the space, whether it is with music or with a podcast, and they take the time to actually respond and comment and encourage, it's the biggest gift in the world to me. I literally look at that and I'm like, oh, wow, you're not just, 90-something% of the internet is just people stopping through and checking out and not engaging. So you have no idea unless you have some kind of metrics going on in the background, right? For traffic. And then you see those comments and you're like, yes, it's working.
Yes.
It's usually those moments where you're like, should I still keep doing this? Like, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I put up a video and I don't see the engagement. I see some spins on it or whatever. And then suddenly somebody's like, this song moved me so much. You have no, and they go on this huge like diatribe about how it like reflected 20 years ago with their life or something. And I'm like, wow, okay. And you shared that and I pulled that out with this music. I'm like, okay, I'm onto something here. It's resonating.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's when you get those kinds of comments and stuff, I always save those because you're also going to get some haters here and there. And so it's like nice to go back and be like, okay, well, that person was a jerk, but I remember this person said this. So
you've been doing it for 10 years. I imagine you've had any number of accolades and negative stuff. Recently I went to Podfest in Orlando in January, and one of the speakers actually was like, good response, bad response. Algorithm doesn't care, algorithm sees engagement. That's all they care about. And if there's people having a negative response or a positive response, great. People are watching your video. Let's pump you up. Let's promote you, and let's do what you got to do. I imagine if there's something nefarious in there or somebody's being really wonky, you want to hide it. But YouTube's pretty good about that too. They'll give you the hit, but you don't have to show it either,
Well, on iTunes, it's Apple Podcasts now, but back in the day, I had gotten this one. It was just a horrendous review that somebody had sent, and I contacted because I'm fine if you want to tell me you don't like something or you think there was an improvement, especially in the beginning. I would take a lot of the stuff that people said to heart and altered the show, changed it up, and did things that they would suggest because I don't know what I'm doing and want to appeal to people. But this person was just awful and accusing me of these things. And so I went to iTunes and I said, this just isn't really fair because there was no way that you could comment back or anything there or like hide it or,
like
YouTube.
Amazon, right? Like on Amazon, if somebody has if you're on a market account, marketplace account, you can at least defend yourself and say, gave this person a refund, offer to do this. They were difficult, but
yeah,
like I resolved the issue. I gave them their money back,
Yeah. And at YouTube, you can hide a comment or something if it's, something that's just awful. Because when I first was on YouTube, I used to get a lot of junk like that. I was like, are there just a bunch of trolls out here?
Yeah, pretty much.
Now I don't get it as bad. But man, in the beginning, I turned off comments for a long time, and then I finally turned it back on, and most of them are pretty constructive. Especially in the beginning, a lot of people would be like, well, this is just a static picture with audio. And I'm like, well, because it's a podcast. Now, now we've moved into a place where it's hard to define what exactly is a podcast. I kind of stand with Adam Curry on, if you're doing video, it's not as much of a podcast as just doing the audio, and that kind of thing. But
I've incorporated it because of brand. My brand is me, so people seeing me, it's like, well, giving a face to the composer and everything is kind of a thing. But there's times that, I have people on a podcast, or I've released a podcast for dozens of episodes where there was no video incorporated into it. And that's just fine too. Like I think that, again, it comes back to, what do you want to do? And what do you resonate with? If a faceless, mostly faceless or faceless podcast or online creative outlet is your thing, is your jam, that's fine. That's fine. There's plenty of people that do just fine with that. I mean, think about the people that do cooking demonstrations where everything's just an overhead shot and they're showing you the prep and the stove and all the stuff, and they do all those jump cuts and it looks delicious. And I'm like, yeah, that's effective. Your voice is nice and you have good editing skills and jump cuts. I'm like, yeah, I'll watch your content forever, and especially when I'm hungry,
Yeah. We do both. We'll throw up, we do a paranormal conversations where we'll have people on, and it's just kind of like this, where it's just kind of a random, off the cuff, whatever, talking about stuff, going back and forth. And we'll throw those videos up occasionally, or if we're actually doing an investigation, we'll throw it up. I'll sometimes, if we're recording with somebody who wanted to share an experience they had, I'll sometimes grab some of it just to throw a short up or a Instagram reel to see if we can get a little bit more traction, because the algorithms like video more.
Do you do that to promote the video as they come out?
Yeah, we'll do it to like or to go along with the show, or just to reach somebody who maybe might not listen to it, but then they're like, maybe that would be an interesting subject to listen to.
Well, with this new platform, which I told you I'd tell you about, with Riverside FM, they have a component. Once you capture all of this and the video gets processed in the background, you can opt for this AI generation, and it looks through basically the transcript. It scans the audio for transcript, and it gets an idea based on the banter and the subject matter that you're talking about. It must use some kind of language model to see, like, oh, here's a section that's about 45 seconds long where somebody jumped on a topic, they talked about it, and they had a ha 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 at the end or something, and then it clips that out, and it does all the edits for you, and then it's boom, and it pulls all the spaces out. It can take out the ums and the ahs, which, nice. If I'm not focused on my voice, I'm doing better and better at that with every podcast. So it's like fail forward, right? You do better and better the more you talk on camera, Yeah. I don't typically have a script other than the show notes that I sent you that, hey, these are some things we're going to probably talk about, just so you're not blindsided about what we're going to speak about. But other than that, I've just learned to enjoy space. Just take a breath, because the audience likes to take a breath too. If you're just hammering them with words every single second, they're gonna want a break.
Yeah, like my ears.
Like short form content, I get it. It's like bam, bam, bam. Here's the point. I jump in the point within the first 3 seconds, or somebody's swiping, right? But when we're talking about this, or a podcast on a location that you're diving in deep, that's going to take some time. That's going to take some real time. What's a location you haven't gotten to yet that you really want to see?
It would have to be overseas, some kind of castle, because, here in America, we have places that they call castles, but they're not really castles. And I've never been to an actual castle before. So I would love to go over to Ireland and check out some of them.
Yeah, there's no shortage there.
Yeah.
And some of the ones I've seen in pictures, I have yet to be to Europe myself either. I'm assuming you've never been?
I've been over to Italy a couple times.
Okay.
But I've never been to Great Britain or Ireland or Scotland or any place like that. And I don't really care to fly that much to begin with, and now it's just getting worse. So.
Oh yeah, with some recent stuff, that'll definitely add to your anxiety of flying for sure.
Yeah, so I'm like, I don't know if I want to be on a plane for hours and hours and hours. So that's part of the issue that I run into. It's like I really want to go see him, but then it's like, oh, but I don't want to be on a plane for so long.
Right. Right. That is a long flight. And even though statistically speaking, you've got a far better chance of being injured in a vehicle than you would
Exactly.
ever be in a plane. If heights are an issue or if time in a box in the air is an issue, I get why that would be problematic for sure. So how do you keep it alive? How do you keep the passion alive with so many episodes? And for that matter, how do you come up with so many different stories to talk about? What's your inspiration?
I have to say, a lot of the places that we cover are suggested by our listeners. So that really helps because a lot of the places I've never heard of before. And then if they have a story about something that happened to them there, it just kind of adds to it. I'm just always so excited about history. It's easy for me when I start to do something where I'm like, oh, I really want to learn about it. So for me, I'm like, if nobody even listens to this, I don't care. I just had a good time researching it. So it's easy for me like that. But a lot of the time it's like I sit there and think, what would a listener want to know about this? I am one of those people, my brain works really funny. I'm always asking why. So I'll read something about something and then I'll get off on a tangent, and we call them rabbit holes, and I'll go down it because I'm like, well, I really want to know that. Like we just did something on the Andersonville prison, which was in Georgia, and it's where the Confederates were held. It was an awful place. And they would have this line that they would put that was about, I can't remember, it was about 10 feet away from the wall. And the prisoners knew that you couldn't go across that line or you'd get shot. And they started calling that line a deadline. And so my brain goes, is that why we call, I've got to get something done, a deadline? And sure enough, it goes all the way back to these deadlines that they would put in these prisons and say, sometimes they would paint a yellow line and be like, you go past that, you're going to get shot. That's the deadline. And now it's transferred over to our world, and most people don't even know. You're like panic because you're like, I've got to get this done by Monday. It's my deadline. And it's like, well, back in the day, you would have been dead.
Yeah, right, right. It's so amazing to me when you study linguistics and the vernacular that we take for granted, and you find out, like, I'm this many days old when I find out that there was actually an origin story for that. That's fantastic. That's amazing. It's just,
and that stuff comes up all the time on the show, and I just always go down that stuff because I'm like, other people may not be asking why or why did that happen or how's that work, but I do. And that's one of the things that helps keep it fresh for me, is that I'm just curious about it. It's probably kind of the same thing. I don't know a lot about making music. I love it, but I'm not very musical myself. And I can only imagine in your brain, you're like, well, what if I, put this chord with that one, or tried using this as a composer? I mean, you're using all different kinds of instruments and stuff. So it's like, what if I throw this in there and this oboe in there and a little bit of flute here, or,
Yeah, absolutely. It's very easy for me we're human beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's very easy to fall into patterns. And some of those patterns, from a composer's perspective, are certain key signatures. It's just what you're comfortable writing in. And if left to my own devices, I would just write in the few there. So I have to push it sometimes and just push the envelope. And that's why I buy new toys and, new VSTs, which is a fancy name for software synthesizers, like new sound banks and everything. And, for $50 to $100, you can get a batch of new stuff. And even if 2 or 3 of the patches are inspiring in some way, shape, or form, I'm like, well, that was worth it. That was worth every penny, because sometimes you just get stuck in a rut using the same sounds all the time. But now I've got a pretty extensive library now, probably over 100,000 instruments, something crazy like that. It sounds crazy. Like, there's variants and stuff in there. It's not all like, I've got 15 different pieces of software that have pianos, and within those pianos, there's, 50 to 100 variants. So,
okay.
So it's not like literally 100,000 different instruments. Some of them are synthetic. There's a lot of synthetic sounds, trailer music, that kind of thing, trailer sounds, all that. But anything that can keep me inspired and keep me doing something a little bit different. It's one of the main reasons, Diane, that I do so many different styles. I've found that as I jump into another style and then come back to something that I'm pretty decent at, like maybe horror, right? Or thriller or suspense stuff. When I jump into electronic music, when I jump into orchestral stuff, which kind of bleeds into the horror stuff too, but I go into those things and I do different things. I learn something new. I come back to horror. My horror sounds different. It's now evolved to this other batch. So that's why I release everything in genre packs whenever at all possible. Because it's kind of selfish, to be honest. It's a way for me to look back and be like, oh wow, where was I then? Right? Like, where was I then with some horror? Like that's very airy and ambient. Not a lot of articulations going on. And then you see this other one, I'm like, ooh, yeah, that's real dark. That's like stuck in the basement in some like torture porn movie or something, you know? It's like, oh
Yeah.
God, where the heck did that come from? And then there's the other ones that are kind of light and fluffy, and, you know, maybe Casper the Friendly Ghost could come out. But those are few and far between for me. I'm usually doing something really scary and spooky, but
Yeah, I was gonna say you're
yeah.
not very the fun horror. You're very dark. I don't know that you've gotten into any carnival. That'd be kind of cool. I'd love to hear some carnival from you.
You're calling me out. I haven't done carnival stuff just yet. I have done some comedy stuff, some short form comedy, and some comedic things that could go into shorts and various online content. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. Like a couple of years ago, I tried lo-fi for the first time, and then that kind of flowed into some of my horror and orchestrations. So now my big thing is funk. There's like it's this new thing, is that, you know, and it's like, I've listened to some of it. It almost sounds, honestly, some of it sounds like it's super low fidelity and like distorting and just like one theme. So I'm like, yeah, I'm going to definitely dive into this. Probably not till the second quarter this year, but I just get inspired by that. I'm like, oh, this is something new. People are still playing around with it. It hasn't really defined itself yet, because you listen to different artists doing different pieces in it. And this one artist, you're like, oh, so this feels like the theme. Then you go to somebody else, you're like, wow, there's like a dance element incorporated into this. I'm like, that's interesting. I'm like, it kind of hasn't found its 100%, or maybe there's just variants of it. But that kind of stuff just fascinates. That same way and same level, I guess, as your story research and diving deep and going down rabbit holes. I do the same thing with music. I'm like, I want to understand why I like this, or why I reel from it initially, and then I'm like, wait a minute, what's that little element? I like that. So then I'll just dive into it, you know?
Very cool. Yeah, your horror, it's very different. Like you said, you do it, and this album sounds so much more different than this one, than that one. And I love listening to them, because sometimes listening to your music inspires me to, maybe I should word this paragraph kind of like this, so it would go with the music a little bit better.
Oh, that's really cool. That's
Yeah.
really cool. Has it ever stimulated a specific episode, like a specific, like, oh, this would be great if I did a story on X, like
I
that
don't
kind
know
of
that
thing?
I've had that, but now I'm
Okay.
thinking I would love to.
Okay.
Especially like Glitch. That just
Yeah.
seems like Glitch. You know, you wouldn't think that's something horrific, but when you're thinking about paranormal, it's something that's outside of the normal, something outside of science. And a glitch could either be like something kind of getting hung up on something, or, you know, they say a glitch in the matrix. Well, what is that? Is that like a time-space continuum getting kind of weird? Or, oh, now I'm getting inspired just thinking about it.
Have you checked out the new site and been able to navigate in there? If you haven't, then after the show's over, I'll give you the linkage to it. But if you haven't gone into the new site,
I don't know that I've gone over to. I know I've read that you said you had it. I don't know that I've been over to it, because I just keep doing my fallback on SoundCloud.
yeah,
But
yeah.
I do need to get over into your site and mess
I'll have
around
to
in it.
since it's been released, I've done a little bit of a walkthrough video, but I haven't gone and done a super deep dive. But it literally has a page that has meta tags in it. So
Okay.
if you're looking for, you get an idea in your head and you're like, I just want spooky, and you click on that, everything I've tagged with spooky shows up.
Perfect.
And then
Awesome.
you can audition each one, and when you click the download button, it's got the attribution language and the download. It's just like all right in this box that comes up in your face. And
Perfect.
And it makes it super simple. I know that there's like a series of steps that you have to take on SoundCloud, and a mentor of mine's biggest advice was keep it simple. The least clicks possible, more people use your stuff. So last year was a big year for me of doing this development, this back end development. It's not done yet. I still want to do
I can imagine.
like a blog to it. I'm going to have an affiliates page and some other things. So
very good.
It'll be really nice. What's one of the biggest challenges that you and your co-host have faced with this talent? 10 years, you had to have had some things like, I mean, scheduling and everything have got to be things that you got to juggle around sometimes, I imagine. But what's the biggest thing? What's the standout?
I think getting to the point of monetization. Because when I first started it, I didn't even think about making any money with it, of course. And then it was almost at the same time that I started the podcast that Patreon started.
Okay.
And so I don't even know how I ran across it. I don't know if somebody was talking about it in a podcasting group or something. So I was like, well, let me go check that out. And I was like, well, that might be kind of an interesting idea because I was totally not ever going to do ads. And then reality set in a few years later.
Right.
I realized, because if you listen to the early shows, I'm always talking about we're fully listener supported and this is the way it's going to be and I'm never going to sell out to ads and all that stuff. And then, so I think that was the hardest thing, is just getting to a point where it's like, okay, I'm going to have to do something more than just the donations, because the donations were making it so that it was paying for itself. Because I even wrote a book when I first started the podcast about starting a podcast on a budget. Because a lot of people think you've got to buy all this, expensive equipment and stuff. This is the original microphone that I bought. I'm still using it, and I paid like $50 for 3 of them.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I tell people a lot of it just comes through in the editing, because sometimes you can get a really fancy and expensive microphone that costs you like $400, $500, and it picks up everything, and you've got to edit that out. I literally have to talk into this thing or it's not going to pick up anything. And it makes it so much easier for editing. I don't have to worry about the dryer's going over there or the dogs start barking or something. It usually won't even pick that up. So it's kind of nice.
Fantastic.
But then as you get going, you start realizing, I kind of want to do this as a profession, a living, and that kind of thing. I've never gotten to the point where I could do it full time, but I've been able to do it part time. And so just figuring out how you go about doing the monetization and that kind of thing has probably been the most difficult journey that I've been on. The scheduling sometimes can get crazy because life happens. And through doing the podcast, I've had a lot of big time life things happen. Like I went through a divorce and my original co-host was my ex-wife. So I had to go through that whole thing. And then, you have life things, my dad gets cancer, I get sick with stuff. So that can be kind of difficult trying to get that in. Because like I said, you want to consistently be putting a show up every single week or every other week, depending upon what your drop schedule is.
Right. And let's be honest, the internet is fickle, right? When you disappear for a certain amount of time, people just make the assumption that you don't exist anymore.
Exactly.
That was one of my big challenges with a site that my music was hosted on for a few years, and then it evaporated. It was like, oh goodness, what am I going to do next? Right? How am I going to, a lot of my momentum is coming from there. So I just kind of sucked it up and said, okay, I've been not keeping all my eggs in one basket. I have some other platforms that I've been seeding with my music. I will go in all in on those and really build a foundation with my website. And then once the website's in place, find ways to promote, put the SEO and the various keywords into my site so that it gets as much exposure as possible. And then just start doing stuff like this and get as much back channeling and backlinking to the site as possible. And that's just going to take time, right?
Mm-hmm.
That literally just takes time, consistency, and coming from a place of authenticity. I think it's brilliant that in the beginning, you didn't have these delusions. You just wanted to authentically tell stories that you were interested in. And I think that speaks to the life of the show, the following that you have, and the fact that you still want to do it after all these years. It still interests you. So you found your thing, which... You're lucky, Diane. Most people don't. Most people get stuck in
that is true.
Some humdrum job, and then they turn 65, and they're like, "Ah, shit! I should have taken the time to, pursue that art career." The blah blah blah. Like, I never wanted to be that guy. I'd been doing stuff with music for many, many years, but the publishing side of things, that had never come. And then it was 4 or 5 years ago that I just took a commitment. I just sat down and I said, "Okay, I'm putting this stuff out there. It's not doing any work on a hard drive. How am I going to go about doing it? And then, I found a path for that. And now here I am. And now I have got an outrageous, idea of a capacity of a catalog that I want to produce. And it starts with people like you. It starts with other creators that resonate with the music and really want to use it. And that's one of the reasons I'm doing this too, is that I get this personal connection. I get to talk to you and I get to understand the needs going forward. Because as I'm building this catalog, I want it to resonate more and more with the people that use it. And that's super important to me. So that's another ask. That's another CTA with the whole call to action with this interview is going forward. I want to make sure that Diane Student's taken care of.
Well, I have to tell you a couple of things I want to make, a couple points on the things that you were saying there. Number one, I know the site that you're talking about, and I could tell you on my end, it was as much of a panic as it was on your end.
Yeah.
Because it was like, wait a minute, this was a great site. And then I was like, where am I going to get Tim's stuff? So I was like, oh my God, no, I can't lose him. So I was really happy to see that you started talking about, I'm going to start doing this, that, and the other thing. Cause I didn't know that you had your stuff up in other places that I could access it to. And I wanted to commend you because you made a little post over on Patreon about how excited you were about the numbers that you were getting on the podcast and listens and things like that. And sometimes people get so wrapped up in the numbers that they can't see the forest for the trees.
Right.
And I always tell people, if you get so wrapped up in those numbers, you are going to have a lot of heartache being a creator because you're going to go up, you're going to go down, things are going to happen. I mean, in the 10 years that I've been doing the podcast, we went from where we didn't have, there's these things called IAB numbers, and it's the way that they count your downloads now to present it to advertisers. Okay. And they really have it locked down because it used to be if you put your link up on, say, someplace like X, if somebody just was going across it, sometimes it would automatically play, and those would count as a download. And so they were trying to stop that because the advertisers were like, no, we want legit, like somebody's really listening to this podcast episode or whatever, so that they're really listening to the ad.
Somebody could game the system with that, obviously.
Exactly.
Right. So,
as they were locking things down, and they've done it several times, you watch your numbers just drop and drop and drop. And there's a lot of people who are like, oh, I'm just not going to do it anymore. I'm just going to give up. Nobody's listening.
Right.
And I've never been hung up on the numbers. I mean, it was very thrilling in the beginning when we initially broke out. And the whole reason we broke out is because a celebrity had been listening to our show and had her own podcast and started talking about it on her podcast.
Oh, that's fantastic.
We just rocketed.
Yeah.
And the really cool thing about that is the way that I've always been as an independent podcaster and an independent creator is I've always wanted to bring, a rising ship brings everybody with them.
Right.
And that's what I've always wanted to do. So like when we do our paranormal conversations, yes, I've had Amy Bruni come on who, has been on TV with Ghost Hunters and Kindred Spirits and everything. But I've also had somebody who has a podcast where they're happy that they have 100 people that have listened to it because they have legitimate stories too. And they're just as exciting to talk to me as it is to a celebrity. And so I think it's great that you're excited about the numbers that you're getting, because if you're getting more than one, somebody's listening, somebody's being touched by it, and it's only going to get better from there.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that post was strictly Podbean. Right. So I do everything through there. I actually have a couple of other endeavors podcast wise that I'm probably going to start this year. And I expanded my account there for that reason alone, because it also they offer publishing with video and audio, which is great. But the interface is really simple. And I know that those numbers are specific to Podbean. Podbean publishes to everywhere else. It publishes to Apple, it publishes to Spotify, so those metrics I've never really been concerned about, and I really haven't dug into, but this year I will, just for the simple fact that, okay, how many people are actually listening to it? Because it's not just Podbean, because if it was just on that platform and it was 500, that's still great in my opinion. There's still people downloading it and listening to it. which is fine. Some of those numbers are mine to test it out, but at the end of the day, I get feedback. I get feedback posting it to YouTube, and I see like YouTube has anywhere from, a dozen or 2 dozen views to like maybe 50 or 60 on some of them. So, and that's independent because now that video has been published directly to YouTube, and those spins don't bounce back to Podbean. So now you're stacking, right? Yep. You're stacking with this platform to over here and ba-boom, ba-boom. And I think just providing some good information and some entertaining dialogue and banter, like that's just, this is what it's all about. And for me, this is about getting to know my fellow creators, whether they use my music or not. But again, the music is a common thread for everything because it ties in to what I'm trying to do. So that gets me excited because when somebody tells me that something's working for them and I didn't have the opportunity to have this conversation, I'm like, yes, this is worth the whole 2 hours alone. Just this one thing you told me. I'm like, yes, I'm so excited.
Well, it's a really difficult thing. People who don't do this may not understand is you're putting yourself out there and you don't know what's going to happen. It's a very vulnerable thing. And you're like, okay, I'm going to put this out there. Are people going to like it, not like it? And some things, they click for people. Sometimes it doesn't. And I never know. I'll be like, this is a really obscure location. I bet nobody's hardly going to listen to this one. And sometimes those are our top shows. And then I have others where I'm like, oh, people are going to go crazy over haunted dolls and stuff. And then, not many people listen. So it's like.
Doesn't resonate.
Yep. Yeah. So I just never know. It's put it out there and see what happens.
That reminds me, I have the same situation come up with albums I release. So one of the challenges I have sometimes is I'll produce a bunch of music and it won't fit into a certain box, but it all fits into kind of a generalized box. Like this is all kind of electronic. It's not EDM. It's not techno. It's nothing like that. It's just some kind of electronic music that it's going to have some utility to somebody, right? So, and I'm like, I want to make sure it's doing work. So I'll put a compilation together. This scramble, by the way, usually happens in the 3rd or 4th quarter of the year where I'm like, trying to hit this number. These are done. I just don't know what to do with them. And I'll be like, okay, I'm going to do like something called mixed bag or something called this. And that's like the 1 or 2 times a year that I do that. I can't tell you how many times a couple of those tracks that I considered quote unquote throwaway, people just go gaga over. They're like, oh, this is like one of your best tracks, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I must have just dropped it down. It was like pure from my soul. I didn't overproduce it or edit it or something. And it just spoke to them. So you just never know. You never know. I've gotten some good advice in the past, and it is probably the most #1 sentence ever that has convinced me to keep going and publish as much music before I die. And it's the following. You don't get to decide what other people like. You just get to make it. So get it out there and get it in their hands. Make it and let it do its work. Just literally get it out there and let it do the work. And I was like blown away because it's so simple, but it honestly is everything I needed to hear. Because if you don't like it, you're not going to resonate with it. You're not going to listen to it. That's fine. Some of my favorite songs don't really resonate. And I don't care because I love them. That they're these orchestrations. I knew I learned something new in some transition or some key signature change or some way that I articulated a phrase. And I can still go back to them to this day and just be like, yeah, like I was on to something like that changed me as a musician. And whether people like it or not, oftentimes they do, but sometimes some of my favorite stuff just doesn't do that. And it's really interesting. It's hard to know what people want or like, but I was going to ask you, between historical stuff and the paranormal intrigue that you've got going on, is there a balance that you try to strike when you're writing these things? Because I'm sure there's this pull to be historically accurate, but there's also this imagining that happens from these stories that makes you want to go down these rabbit holes and have these tangents and maybe postulate like, oh, maybe this is what's happening. And imagine if this is what this was all about? Do you find yourself in a common, like a middle ground for all that, or how does that work?
I kind of just let each location episode dictate itself. I try to go for like a half and half because you have people who come to you because they absolutely love history, and the ghost stories are like, I don't know if I believe that, or it's not really my thing, but I'll listen to them. And then you have other people who they're like, just give me the ghost story. So I always say I have a higher caliber of listener because, you know, they want to listen to the history too. Because there's a lot of shows that it's like they just give you the, you know, instead of throwing the potatoes in there too, they just give you the meat. And I like to throw a lot of potatoes on there too. So a lot of it is like, how much information is there on a location? How many ghost stories are there with a location? Because there's some places that have been like done to death and they have a ton of information and a lot of people have been to them. And then there's other places that are a little more obscure and there's not a whole lot out there. And so I just kind of let the episode dictate where it's going to go. And I try to get kind of a balance about half and half. And usually for an episode, I shoot to get at least 30 minutes. 40 minutes is like the main thing that I'm going for. It's like, that's the sweet spot. If it goes over, that's great too. And I used to think, if you do these long form shows, people are not going to listen because everybody has such a short attention span. They don't want to listen to something that's really long. And then you look at what the top podcasts are and you're like, oh no, people love long form. They love it because
commuters, right? Like people get into a car, they've got 45 minutes, at least down here in Tampa, 45 minutes to an hour is easy to go from one place to another. Easy, especially during rush hour. So if you got a podcast that lasts, 45 minutes to 2 hours long, great. That's a round trip. You can listen to the whole thing, heading down and coming back. Has there ever been a story or location that's made you particularly uneasy?
My problem is for a lot of places, I will tell you, I've been into some really freaky, scary places, at least the way that they're described, and I have yet to go into a place and be scared.
Okay.
Now, I haven't had any negative, what I would call negative experiences yet. Things that would unnerve me are, you don't really run into a lot of demonic stuff, but anything that gets into the demonic already makes me a little bit uneasy because I don't know what we're dealing with there. And so it's like, is it because sometimes people will say, oh, well, that's a demon. And it could just be, if you're a jerk in life, you're probably going to be a jerk in the afterlife. It just carries over that way. Or if you were, you did something really bad here, you might have to, I don't know, pay for it in the next life. Because that's the one thing we don't really know. We can all kind of guess what happens after this life is over. The one thing I know for sure is that there is something after this, just based on my experiences. What that is, I don't know for sure.
I think that's a healthy attitude, by the way, because getting stuck in dogma and thinking that we know or anybody knows is kind of a scary place. And it's also why we have division. So
absolutely.
So it's being open-minded to the fact that we don't know. And that, I know it's cliche, but the older I get, the more I realize I don't know and the more humble I become. I don't think that works for everybody, but for me personally, I think, honestly, I just get more and more humbled as I get older. And I think it's an important place to be because we just don't know. There's so much to learn and so much. You can't do it in one life. You couldn't do it in 100,000 lives. There's so much information, especially now, with the era that we're living in today. God knows what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years with some of this technology and how quickly we can learn things.
I mean, just looking what they're doing, trying to put, chips in your head and stuff like that. I mean, can you continue to go on even after your body's done,
Yeah, that might be the case.
Well, and the thing is, despite all the people who've had interacted with spirits or communicated with spirits or whatever, I have yet to find one that says, okay, here's exactly what happens. You die and then there's like this tunnel and then, you go to heaven and this is what it looks like. And this is all the rules that you have to follow. Nobody's ever done that. So, I'm like, there must be some barrier to that as well that they can't tell you, or maybe they don't even know. One thing that we suggest a lot on the show too is when you're talking about spirits and different things that they do, whether it's the way they appear or if they're moving objects or something. I kind of liken it to the movie Ghost, where Patrick Swayze is learning how to do different things, and it takes him a while to figure out how to, move a penny or hit a can or actually show up and appear. We always kind of joke around, well, when you're in the afterlife, there's different levels that it takes you a while. So that's why we see people in period clothing now and not parachute pants, because everybody who died in the 80s hasn't gotten to a point yet where they can just, show up in their parachute pants and stuff. It's the people who died in the 1800s that have gotten to the point now where they can like reveal themselves completely. So it just takes you that long to learn the way it goes.
Well, understanding a infinitely small amount of quantum theory and quantum mechanics, it just lends itself, in my mind's eye, to the fact that there is so much about reality that we're just not even close to understanding. So the idea and the thought that there's some in between, some afterlife, maybe a resonation above what we exist at right now, that sometimes pokes its head into our existence because they're in some kind of limbo stage for whatever reason. Maybe they can't let go of the life that they had and they can't move on to the next stage of existence, whatever that is, if that's even a thing. It just fascinates me to postulate on that, because this is just too wild of an existence and an experience to be just this, and we just vaporize and then we go to nothing. I don't buy into it. I don't necessarily buy into the dogma of most religions either, and I grew up Roman Catholic, so I had my struggles with that and breaking away with that to understand that there's a bigger world out there spiritually and metaphysically and everything else, But that being said, I think honestly, these kind of stories, like going in, doing deep dives in this, just reinforces for me that there's elements and things that are unexplainable, and pure scientists and pure dogmatic religious believers will just answer that away to some simplistic 5 or 6 answer series of question and answers, is like, well, that's because blah, or that's because this, blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, how do you know? How do you know? Somebody told you to say that as a response to that particular element of existence. This didn't come from you. You're just repeating what somebody told you. And I think life is about discovering the answers for yourself.
Absolutely. One of the things I love to ask people if we're interviewing somebody, one of the standard questions I ask is, to you, what is a ghost? Because I like to hear what people's ideas are. And a lot of people, they'll just jump in and go, oh, well, it's the spirit of a dead person, because that's what they think the answer is supposed to be. And then I'll tell them, well, here's what I think a ghost is. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, they hadn't really thought about it, because we don't know what a spirit or a ghost is.Maybe it is somebody who's passed away and their spirit is still here. For some reason, it's still working on something, or you can come back and forth. A lot of people see their grandparents, or something, and they're like, oh, grandma came and visited me, but I thought she was in heaven. How does that work? But then I run the gamut. I'm like, I think it could be all different kinds of things. Like you said, we have the quantum world. There's the time-space continuum. We have no idea how that works. If there's something like where time can just fall into itself, because maybe, I mentioned earlier, you see somebody in a period dress. Well, maybe that woman over there in that period dress is looking at me, and we're both in our time periods, but we can see each other for some reason. And she's looking at me, probably going, why is that woman wearing pants or shorts or whatever?
Right. At an era when that wasn't a normal thing, right?
Yeah. And I'm looking at her going, oh, it's a ghost in a period dress, but she's just as alive as I am. We're just in different time periods.
Did you ever read the book Flatland?
I have not, no.
Okay. So it was written by, forgive me if this is wrong, but I believe it was a Benedictine monk back in like the 16 or 1700s or something. And I'll give you a quick synopsis, 1,000 foot of the story. And feel free to go back and read it. It's a fascinating read if you're into science and understanding of the quantum world and reality as we perceive it, right? Because it's all about perception. So there's like the square that exists in 2 dimensions. Imagine a world where you only have 2 dimensions and there is no such thing as a third, right? And the square had his little house and his neighbors and stuff, and they'd come up on each other and he'd go into his house or whatever. And then at some point in the story, some other being reaches down, grabs the square, picks him way up high in the sky and drops him. And as he drops, he floats down and he sees this third dimension as he's falling, but he has no definition for it. And as he falls to the ground and lands, he suddenly appears in front of his fellow squares out of nowhere, seemingly just warps into existence. So now his challenge is, how do I explain to everybody around me what I just experienced? I don't have a definition for it. I have no way to articulate what I just experienced. That, I think, may in fact be what our experiences are with ghosts. Ghosts are merely existing in a different frequency at a higher register, and they occasionally drift in and out of the plane that is 3-dimensional existence. And when you see them for a blip, for whatever period that is, they're just doing their thing, and yet they can interact with you, but then they can't interact with you, or they can interact with you somewhat, as long as they're maintaining their connection with the plane that we exist on, and then just as quickly they can disappear. And it's almost the same thing, you know? It's almost a parallel of that story, and that just fascinates me, because it's like, we don't know, but that makes me think that maybe that's the answer, or maybe some variant of that, or maybe it's a blip of another time that just comes into our reality for whatever reason that is. There's some schools of thought that suggest that there is no such, I mean, time is an illusion anyway. Time is a factor of us rotating around the sun and our rotation to the earth and everything. And literally, there's a school of thought that's everything exists at once. So every iteration of Diane, every iteration of Tim exists simultaneously at the same time. It's what we focus on that becomes the reality, because our universe is literally like, oh, you're living in your own little universe. Yes, I am, because everything I perceive is exactly what I perceive to be my universe, and yours is different, and mine is, and everybody else. So it's just fascinating. I could go down that rabbit hole forever.
Sure. And the whole reason why I believe that we continue to go on is not just based on experiences I've had, but I believe that we're an energy. And energy doesn't go away. It dissipates and may become something else, but it doesn't just go away.
Right.
And that's the thing, too, with ghosts, is that you could be looking at something that, like, every so often people will describe, we'll call it residual. And this is something where they see, like, a battle at Gettysburg getting played out over and over and over again. And people will be like, well, is that a ghost? Is that not a ghost? And we kind of talk about that being something that is just an energy that gets locked in to the land. And we don't know why. We don't know if it's, you know, is there like limestone and quartz and something else? They call it stone tape theory. And so this energy gets locked in there somehow. Or another example would be somebody who went through something like, let's say a woman gets murdered or something, and it's such a traumatic experience and there's so much energy wrapped in there that you may see that murder getting played over and over and over again. And it's just like, and you know, that makes your brain like hurt thinking about how does that energy get trapped there? And then like what makes it play?
Quantum entanglement of an experience that gets replayed over and over again because of the emotional charge associated with it. It was so powerful, right?
Yes.
That
and
now
it's not intelligent. You can't really interact with it.
Yeah. But then what is it? Right? It's kind of like a virus. A virus isn't alive.
Sure.
It is when it attaches itself to other cells, but in and of itself, it can lie dormant, like in Antarctica. In fact, they've thawed out things in Antarctica and literally have found viruses in the permafrost there that have been sitting there dormant for millions of years and just waiting for a host. I mean, that's the thing, you know, like the movie that was
the
like
thing,
an action.
literally.
Yeah, literally the thing. Like, what the hell? So, I mean, just bizarre stuff, right? I mean, just incredible. So you touched on earlier, I want to talk about this. You touched on earlier how glitches, like specifically, it sounds like you jumped into, did you jump into my glitch stuff, or you talk about glitches in real life? Because I do music that's called glitches. So I was going to springboard.
Well, I was specifically talking about your music called Glitch, but how it can be defined in different ways.
Yeah. So that made it really interesting to me, and it made a good transition and segue into what music do you search out for specifically for your various shows, and what led you to think that a different style that isn't necessarily horror or spooky would fit at a show? Did you literally drop it into the timeline while you were talking over the music and be like, this kind of sets the mood that I'm looking for, and I didn't even realize that this might juxtapose against it properly and set the mood? Like, how did you come across that, or what in your mind makes that work?
Thinking about something that might be outside of, the way that we understand things. It's kind of like, when you hear Stephen King and he's talking about when he's writing and he'll say, well, the story kind of wrote itself. And I'm wondering if you kind of have that happen sometimes with your music. It's almost like something's coming through you, like you're not actually as cognitive maybe about it.
Mm-hmm.
I feel almost like sometimes the music grabs me or pulls me in, because I'll just be listening to different things and then all of a sudden I'll be like, that's the one. And I've gotten so many comments from listeners, which is a tribute to your music specifically, because I think you're probably, other than Kevin MacLeod, you are the most used music I've ever used on the podcast.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
And people are always complimenting the music that we use. And they're like, that just went really perfectly with the show. And I like to do it towards the beginning of us getting ready to tell everybody what's happening here, because it's like setting the stage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I just kind of listen to the music and I'm like, does that really make me feel like I'm setting the stage? And I'll think about like where we're at. Like if we're talking about a place that is a ghost town, of course, I'm going to gravitate towards something that has a Western kind of sound to it. If
I'll
we're
have more of
talking,
that.
yes, that's why I'm like, I need you to do more of that, because there's a dearth. There's not enough there for me to go after your stuff. So I'm like, oh, I have to go find somebody else's stuff. But I guess it's just the music sometimes calls to me, and yours just really clicked for me. I don't know. There was just this connection, and I can't even tell you I could tell you what album was the first ones that I started listening to, but I don't know why all of a sudden it was like, oh, wow. And it was Evil Wind was the first stuff that I started listening to. And I was like, you get it. It's like, because I'm like a really bright person. I'm not a dark person, but I totally gravitate towards really dark music. And so that Evil Wind really kind of hit that, like, I'm looking for something dark and creepy, but not completely evil. I don't know.
Yeah.
And your music just, it hits the right balance of everything for me. And then as I would go with it, it was just like, and I loved how you would title different things, because it's like, short form nightmares kind of thing. And I'm like, that's exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something that's just going to be that little 30-second puts the person there, or something that goes perfect behind a story we're telling.
So that evolved recently in the last year and a half, 2 years. I was finding that when somebody's looking up music, there's a different schools of thought. There's, I want a piece that evolves and does all these things, blah, blah, blah. With shorter form content, you don't necessarily want that. You want to know whatever you're getting and putting into a timeline, it's not going to vary very much. And if it does, it might be an instrumentation that comes in, goes away, gets replaced by something else. But the underlying theme is the same. And initially, from a artist creator perspective, it feels a little bit like a cop-out, because I don't have a build-up. I have a verse, but the verse doesn't go anywhere, and there's no chorus, there's no bridges, there's no section where things get quiet and I shut everything down. It just kind of does the same thing to varying degrees for a minute and a half. But here's the thing. I'm providing a utility. So it's not always about a complete thought or an evolving thought. Sometimes it's just a simple, complete thought that handles the job, that does the thing it's supposed to do. That's been really interesting, because there's some very basic things that I developed on those two horror albums, the short form horror 1 and 2, that have gotten a lot of usage. And it's really because of what you just spoke to which was you drop it, you know what you're getting. What you see is what you get. And it has the feel. And it makes it easier to scrub through it because you can go through the list. You're like, all right, Tim's got another 15 of these. Let's try a couple of these. I try to label them in such a way that articulates exactly what you like, what to expect from it. And there's the punny ones too. But even the punny ones come from a place where I'm thinking about how it sounds to me, and hopefully whoever's in my tribe or whoever will eventually get brought to my tribe, they'll get it. It's kind of like Mystery Science Theater 3000, right? Yeah. Some people will get it, right? And it's like, but that's the idea, is that coming from an authentic place and writing things authentically and trying to give it a label that's authentic to the music. Clearly it spoke to you, and clearly it said something to you that's like I can go in here. I know what to expect from this. You're not going to say Holly Jolly Christmas and it's going to be death metal, it's yeah. I'm going to paint that or color that in such a manner that you're going to know exactly what you're in for. I finally did a music holiday compilation this year. My intention was to do like five albums of like 8 tunes, and every single year over year, the last 3 years, I was like, I'm like, July, I'm like, let's do Christmas music. Let's start it right now. And then November comes and I'm like, man. Whoops. I'm like, I only have 4 of them. I'm like, and this year I was in a similar boat, and I fired out a jazz album in the process that I had no intention of writing, none whatsoever. And all of a sudden, like 6 or 8 tunes came out of me, and I'm like, well, I better finish that and publish that. That's not Christmas, but I'm like, here we go. But then I ended up just giving myself the leeway. I'm like, okay, one album, it's got 3 different styles on it. It had traditional, it had lo-fi, and I even did like 1 or 2 dreamcore tracks that were like, sounded barely like Oh Christmas Tree or something like that. But I got a ton of downloads on SoundCloud for them. People are just like, ooh. So I'm like, next year I'm going to experiment again a little bit more. Because again, push the envelope. You may or may not have stumbled across this, but sometime last summer, I discovered through, there's like a US archive, I forget the name of it, but they had completely public domain music from the 20s. And somebody had created a website that had a bunch of samples on it that you can grab and, make articulations and music out of and do loops and stuff. So I pulled down some of that stuff, and then I played music over the top of it. I use it as a bass inspiration for stuff. And I did this like Roaring Twenties, like clubby, weird electronica thing. And it was a blast. I'm like, I'm definitely doing another one of these, because this is nowhere. This is so far out of my wheelhouse and such an exploration of like just another genre. I'm like, I had so much fun with it. I could care, like, again, not in a negative way, but like I didn't care if anybody liked it necessarily. I grooved on it and I was like, wow, this is a lot of fun.
Well, I love that style of music from the 20s and the big band and everything. And I was like, I wonder what this is. And it was I have to say, it was very interesting. And I love that you pushed the envelope with it, because it was like, this is really cool because it's not what you're expecting, but you can hear it like in the background of it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I haven't used any yet, but there's a couple of places that we've done that are kind of like the Seelbach we just did. And it's a place that makes you think about the 20s because it inspired the novel, The Great Gatsby.
Oh, okay.
And so it's like, that probably would have been really cool. I should have maybe used a piece from that, because it kind of gives it a little bit of a creepy effect. Other people may not see it as that, but anything that changes the music up in a way that's disturbing maybe, or not, because it is disturbing to you if you don't expect it to sound a certain way.
Right.
And so I'm like, anything that kind of disturbs. That's why I like some of the glitchy stuff you do and that kind of thing. Because what you're trying to do is, there literally is music that you can write that will physically disturb somebody. It's a lot of the stuff that you'll see in a horror movie. There'll be certain pieces that they use, or there's like the devil's chord that you can use. And it's actually manufactured in such a way to disturb you. And that's why you get that feeling like your skin's crawling or whatever. Not that I'm saying that these jazzy music makes the skin crawl, but it's just, it's kind of, it's different on your senses.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. Some of the horror stuff, like just these orchestral crunches and weird atonal things, like those are the ones that I think people are like, I don't even know if I hear a note yet. Like, I don't even, that's disturbing because I've written pieces that don't resolve. They keep moving around, and in pop music, there's resolution, right? You're in a key signature and you come down the pipeline and there's maybe 4 or 5 chords that are part of the song, maybe a few different ones in the bridges and, the transitions from the verse. But basically you're getting the same thing over and over and over again. It's about repetition. It's about speaking to who we are. We are creatures of habit. The horror stuff is intentionally made in such a way that it's supposed to just mess with you, And I don't even define sometimes what I'm doing. I had one called, I think it was just rising tension or like nails on a chalkboard or something like that. And it just keeps rising. And I just fade it out. Like I do different things to keep it rising up, and like the different pieces just keep coming up. And it's like, I don't know, lava coming up from the floor, or like ghosts and like demons coming up and rising. And then there's like vocals in the background, like just like all that. And they're just done. It's like, there's no resolution. You don't get that,
You're like, don't I get to go down the hill now? You
No.
took me to the top of it.
No, it's supposed to do this work. And that's why I leave it the way it is, So that might be what makes a lot of those effective, is that I don't adhere to standard models. And just for some, for your benefit, some background with me, I took some theory for a few years in high school, and then I joined the high school rock band, at which time I was introduced to ear learning, just throwing a CD in and learning the chords, learning the bass stuff, learning the melody. And within 3 weeks to a month, I was learning more pop music and playing more music than I'd ever done before. And I just abandoned theory. Now, the interesting thing is that I can go back and understand the different modes and everything, but sitting down and reading music is not my vernacular. I never do that. I sit down at a keyboard. I can hear the notes in my head. I find them relatively quickly and build off of that. And then it's pulling in the different pieces and even key signatures that are kind of, they're not the perfect fifth or the sixth. Like a major key is on the 1 and then the minor key is on the 6th note, typically in a scale. Like I'll do weird stuff with that and alter that, but like not even consciously. I just find the next notes that make sense, and just that's just my process. So for somebody like would you ever teach anybody music? I'm like, no, I don't know what to tell them.
Yeah,
it's super intuitive for me. It's super intuitive, and I just like I call it this in parts of my life, and I call it in music. It's the big magnet. It's the big magnet pulling you. When you stop resisting, and it's like you're speaking to something you said earlier about things flowing through you or coming through you. It's when you take the time to be in the right state of mind, sitting down at the keyboard or sitting down editing or deciding on your next podcast and next subject matter you're gonna study in the paranormal. You just kind of let it flow and decide what's next based on what feels right. And man, if people just stopped bombarding themselves with social media or some kind of stimulation for 5 minutes and just sat still and listened for that, they could find their passions and they could build off those passions so much easier. And I think that finding that inner voice and listening to it has been a huge, huge part of my journey.
It's so great. There's so many people where it's like, yeah, if you would just sit for 5 minutes and just sit. And people have such a hard time doing that. Just like I was talking about attention span earlier, most people, it's like, if it's more than a minute and a half, 2 minutes, I'm on to the next thing. And it's like, it would be so great if people could just learn unfortunately, a lot of our young people, they're being conditioned that way now to always get something that's entertaining
swipe.
Yeah.
Like, you know.
And they don't just sit for a moment and turn everything off and just be in your space. And I totally get what you're talking about. My brother-in-law, he's an amazing musician. He can't read music at all. Everything he does is just by ear. He just listens to something and then he can play it. And I can't play I can't do nothing. And I'm just like, that just blows my mind that you guys can do stuff like that.
Well, you could make an amazing podcast that lasts 10 plus years. So that's it. And you know what
that's
it comes down to?
That's where my talent is, yes.
It comes down to one word. One word. Discipline. And that word has a negative connotation to some. Mm-hmm. But for me, at this stage of my life, discipline is nothing more than doing the thing you know you need to do, that you're passionate about and you love, regardless of how you feel. Right? And that's anything from, hey, I need to exercise so many times a week. I need to eat right. I need to consistently ideate on new pieces of music. That requires discipline. If I'm not consistently doing something in a disciplinary manner, I'm not going to move forward with any of those things. And your podcast is a testament to discipline, because you've clearly stuck to your guns for this long. And I can only imagine we're going to have this conversation in 10 more years and you're still going to be at it.
Hopefully. I'm hoping I will be. I hope I don't know what it's like to be a ghost on the other end. Yeah, that's great. I love that word, discipline. I mean, I've always been kind of disciplined throughout my life, but I found with age, I've gotten better about it. I don't know if it's because you're also facing your own mortality, so you know you have less time. So it's like, what do I want to get done and what I have left? So I would hear people talking about a midlife crisis and, oh, they go out and buy a sports car and then they do this kind of thing. And you don't really quite understand it. And then you get there and you're like, I think people don't know how to define what a midlife crisis really is. It's not like, I mean, if you're going out and buying a sports car because you're like, oh, I'm trying to sow my young oats again or something. To me, it's not really a midlife crisis. It's more like a midlife plan. It's like you get there and you're like, okay, I know that at least the way my body works, my best years are behind me because, you know, I get up in the morning and it's like I have clients. My real job is housekeeping. And most of my clients here, especially here in Florida, are older people. And I just look at them and, you know, they're in their 80s. And I'm like, how do you get out of bed in the morning?
Because I ache, okay? Yes. I just turned 50. So there's mornings that I get up and I ache. Now, granted, I think part of my issue is a statin I'm on, which I have to check into and see if that's really what's aggravating. Because 4 or 5 years ago, I had a PR in a half marathon. I did it in like just over 2 hours. Mm-hmm. So I have no excuse. I'm not going to let my body go downhill wicked fast. Why am I getting thumbs up? I literally just went like this and...
It did that earlier too, and I'm like, how is he getting it to do that?
I'm like, what's up? What is going on over here? But no, I refuse. I refuse to go down without a massive fight, and I will not be one of those people that has a hard time getting... I will shed the weight I have to. I'll do the exercise, whatever, because I want to do this as long as humanly possible. Like, I want another 50 years on this planet, minimum. And
yep. Every morning I get up and run 2 miles, and it's
good for you.
Not because I love to get up and do it. It's part of it is just I want to stay healthy and I want to be around as long as I can, and I don't want to be in a wheelchair or whatever later on. And with the statin thing, you don't need to be worrying about your cholesterol, so you probably don't even need to be on it.
Yeah. That's something I'm dealing with this spring. And since I've shifted from, I know this is shifting way non sequitur, but since I shifted away from red meat and I'm lowering my sugar intake and consuming more vegetables and fruit and more poultry now, all that's going to shift everything I want to do into a better light, I think. So the next step is to just do hey, I want to come back in and do a cardiac ultrasound, you know, and then have some blood work done. And I'm going to go off this for 3 months. I want to see if I'm doing what I need to. And then if that's the case, you know, it runs in my family, and my heart disease runs in my family, but it's also, a lot of it was, you know, personal health choices. Mine was like on the cusp, but you know, of course, every doctor wants to give you that prophylaxis of like, oh, you got to go on this, you got to do this, and blah. And I'm like, that's a whole nother topic. We could do a whole nother podcast on
We
that.
definitely could.
On poisoning ourselves with the things in this country, the medications and the over processed foods. Don't need that, you know?
Yeah.
Well, before we go, I thought I would invoke your advice for anybody that's listening to my podcast and get your advice on how would you tell somebody today to start a podcast? Like, what advice would you give to starting a podcast and doing what you're doing? Have like a long running podcast that they enjoy and they resonate with for as long as you have.
Well, like I said earlier, the number one thing is make sure it's a topic that you won't get bored with, that you think you're going to do for a long time, and try to think about doing something unique. Because I'll tell you, like in my genre, it's a dime a dozen at this point, where it's specifically two girls drinking booze and telling each other ghost stories. And I'm like, everybody's doing that. So try to think of an angle that's different than what other people are doing. Just like you said with your music, go a different path, because if you sound like everybody else, you're not going to get people's attention. They're going to be like, oh, well, I heard that piece over there too with that guy, and then that girl had that piece over there that sounded similar. So try to find a unique take on whatever it is that you specifically, whatever topic it is that you want to cover. The second thing is, you don't have to have all this expensive equipment and have all this stuff ready to go. You're going to learn as you go. So don't think you've got to have everything in line from the very beginning and be complete professional from the beginning. Just do it. Because if you don't just do it, you'll keep putting it off, and I'm not ready. Just do it.
Yeah. That failure to act because everything isn't in place and it's not perfect yet. I got a secret for you. It's never perfect. It's never. The songs I release, they're never 100% what I want them to be. Ever. At some point you have to put it down or you're going to destroy it. You know, it's this passion piece that you love so much, but you could very easily overwork it. And I think you can do the same thing in life with the things that you're interested in. Just try it. Right? Podfest was a perfect example. There was a statistic there that there was like a 30% of podcasts don't go past the first episode. 70% plus don't go past 10. Oh, bunch of people tried it, didn't work for them, or they didn't have the discipline to continue with it. Or maybe in another example, maybe it was a short form podcast. It was a mini series that did the work it was supposed to, and they moved on, which is fine too. But the point being is that I give every single one of those people that did that credit, because they didn't have to pick up a microphone and come up with some ideas and take the time to publish it and share it with the world. So bravo to them for even trying in the first place. But it just goes to show you that you can see these statistics online on how many podcasts are out there and everything, and it can be disheartening. Like, I'm just going to be white noise amongst all that thing. There's not as many consistent podcasts out there as you think. People come and go, and they don't last very long. So kudos to you for sticking around as long as you have. I think you're an example of, again, I come back to the word discipline, you know, a disciplinary approach to a labor of love that clearly resonates with you and your audience. So with that, I think would be a great place to stop. And I absolutely loved having this opportunity to talk with you today, Diane. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to catch up and meet in person for the first time, virtually, of course, but you know what I mean. I mean, I don't even think you have to define it like that anymore. This is really what people do now. I mean,
generally, yeah.
It's a lot cheaper than traveling, that's for sure.
That's true. Although we're in the same state, so the chances of us meeting up are a little bit easier.
That's true. And the next time I'm in your area, I'll have to ping you guys and maybe stop, meet up with you for lunch or something, because that would be a treat.
I'd heard you were going to be at Podfest, and literally that weekend, usually either on a Saturday or a Sunday, I'm not doing something. I only have like one of them I might be doing something. Of course, that weekend, both days were totally full. So it was like, oh man.
And I actually dipped out a little early, not because I became discouraged with anything at the event. The event was amazing. In fact, it was a bit overwhelming. There was 5 days of just boom, like half an hour sessions back to back where you're just like, oh my God, I'm
So
still
much
reeling from it,
information.
you know? And luckily there's a once a month meetup every Tuesday from out here in Tampa that have some of the original members of Podfest and the founder. So there you go. I can extend my learning and my networking beyond by attending that periodically throughout the year.
I keep telling Chris that I'm going to get over there, and I haven't done it yet. So I need to get over there one of these days and join one of the meetings.
Personable person great. I've ever met. That runs this international expo. That's the longest running podcast expo in the world. But as you walk up to him and he'll talk, whether you're a 1 million follower person or 1 person follower, he will give you the same amount of time and attention. And that's the kind of people I like. I like people like that. That's why when I go out and do my gratitude on YouTube and thank people for using my music, it doesn't matter if they have 5 subscribers or 5 million. Thank you very much for using my music, you know? So, well, thank you so much. I can't wait to see what else we collaborate on as the months and the years progress here. And as always, if there's something specifically you're looking for, you know where to find me. But thanks again for being on a podcast, and we'll talk to you real soon.
Thank you, Tim. It was my pleasure.